David and I have really thoroughly enjoyed this month of talks. If you enjoyed them even half as much as we have, then you've gotten a lot out of them. We have found a new spark of sharing spirituality and conversation this last month, to the point that sometimes we wake up in the middle of the night, and of course it's me that usually says, "Are you awake?" And no, you're usually awake. And then we proceed to have several hours of conversation about this thing called life, the way it works, what it does, and how to use it. And it is so exciting that one day when we were in conversation, he said, "Honey, why don't we just go with chapter 1, and he really meant chapter 1. Go with chapter 1, just go all the way through the book with our talks." And I was like, that's a lot of talks. That's a lot of chapters. How about if we start with 1 and see where it goes? So that's what we're doing. We are starting with chapter 1. And this is David's book. And the 4 of the 5 bookmarks are mine already. He said I could use it because mine's falling apart as long as I promise to take out those bookmarks when we're done. Okay, that's an easy one. No, I decided not to, because I started putting bookmarks in mine too, and then I thought, oh boy, I'll get all confused. So chapter 1 is In the Beginning, God. And our actual title is Creative Thought in the Universal and the Individual. The beginning of the beginning of chapter 1 goes like this. We wish to discover what to believe in, why we believe in it, why such a belief is reasonable, and insofar as possible to enter into the nature of the invisible cause of this manifest life of ours. We wish to discover how this cause works, its relationship to us, and our relationship to it, and how we may use this knowledge. So that is a lot of what we do regularly. Yeah, I know I'm not going to read the next sentence, because the next sentence, Ernest Holmes says that we've all gotten very tired of symbols, and we intend to use a couple of symbols. So we're not going to read that next part. But we are going to explore today.
One of the challenges we have as expressions of the divine in human form is that we look at things in form and structure, and quite often that results in a kind of dualism in terms of seeing ourselves as separate from all things that there are. And I think when we look at the yin and yang symbol, we see a pretty strong sense of dualism, because it's the black against the white. It seems like they're opposing forces, but they're not really. In the yin yang symbol, there's a dot of the yin in the yang, and a dot of the yang in the yin. This symbolizes the interconnectedness of the opposite forces as different aspects of the Tao, which is the first principle, all that is. All opposites are manifestations of the single Tao, the one whole, and are therefore not independent from one another, but rather a variation of the same unifying force throughout all of nature. Pretty science of mind idea, isn't it? We're all interconnected into one, showing up as each other. Now we look at the symbol and we know that it means in terms of opposites, good and bad, right and wrong, and so on. And what if we looked at a symbol from a different kind of a point of view, maybe from the idea of God the universal, or God showing up as us as individuals? We quite often see that spiritual sense of ourselves if we look hard enough, but it's easy to find that physical part of us as we try to walk through a door and bump into it. We don't open it, or stumble into things in the dark. We see that our physical form is real, but we also recognize that part of us which is spiritual, But if we use this symbol, we can understand that God is all that is, the whole. But we are individualized aspects of the whole. So we can be half of that equation in terms of our thinking of our physical and spiritual natures of who we are, and know that God is in the very center of who we are. And we are, of course, since God is all that is, we are in the center of all that God is at the same time. How do we make that work in our own lives?
Well, for me, I look at it from the idea of the divine feminine and the divine masculine. And when David brought this idea to me with the symbol, for me, it's like the dot is God in me, and at the same time, it is me in God. Both in the masculine, divine masculine, and the divine feminine, because truly most of us have probably done those tests where we found out which quadrant we fit in and whether we're left brain, right brain more or whatever. But the truth is we want to be balanced, and God is that. God is that perfect balance. And so as we develop ideas for this within ourselves, we become greater expressions of God in the world.
And so one of the great purposes of Taoism is to understand balance and understand how we are spiritual and physical cooperating with each other all the time.
Did you want to move into the next
I'll move
symbol?
another symbol here.
All
You might
right.
recognize this one. Kind of similar in a way, isn't it? We have the big circle representing all that is. And the top part of the circle we would consider to be the essence of God, the consciousness or the realm of possibilities. And then the bottom is the form, where we are, in physical form. And in the middle is the law in which we communicate back and forth. And of course we get that big V in the middle, which stands for victory. And it also stands for the idea of that which is unformed substance moving through the law into form. And then when we release it out of form, it goes back into the unformed substance to become whatever we choose or wish to make it be in the future. So it's kind of a similar idea, than recognizing that God is all that is. God is both in the unformed substance, the realm of possibility, and in the form substance where we are. So God is us, God is all that is, and we are part of the entire equation.
Yes, as a teaching tool to be able to intellectualize this as the idea of this is all God, and then at the same time be able to know that since you are of that, you are also all of this, and able to move things through law into form.
It's also important for us to remember too that we quite often call this the symbol of divine creation, the creative process. And knowing that that creative process works in the realm of Godness and how God creates, and also works exactly the same way for us in terms of how we create. We use the exact same process that God uses to create in the universe.
And that is exactly what you just said. All form is temporary, and by that, what we mean is that form is ever changing. And therefore, in that way, God is always changing, and at the same time, God never changes because God is all that is. But in our worlds, it's ever changing.
If God is all that is, then God can't change into something else, because God would be changing into something that God already is. So God is changeless. We change according to our preferences and what we hold in consciousness. But that which is God within us, our spiritual nature, never changes. We can change the forms to create another form, but the essence of the unformed substance, the essence of reality within us, never changes, and it never goes away, and never diminishes, for that matter. Consciousness is what we use to change, and consciousness is what holds form in its manifest condition. Quantum science talks about that, collapsing possibility waves into particles. We use consciousness and attach consciousness to waves and cause them to collapse into particles, and then they become form. And they will stay in that form until we release the consciousness that is holding them together. The consciousness is like the glue that holds atoms together to form a table or a chair or us. So there's a question about why are we trying to express, or what are we trying to express by holding conditions in their manifest form? My answer for that is more than likely we are trying to express ourselves out into the universe, and we're finding things that express ourselves spiritually and physically, and so therefore we attach ourselves to those.
And my answer would be that we're always expressing something different, that we're always shifting. And I noticed today as we were reading and sharing the principles, which we do every 5th Sunday, when there's a 5th Sunday in the month, I was noticing a couple of the ideas that are really what we're talking about today, and it's the discovery within, and how the more we engage in these conversations, the more we grow ourselves. So one of them was that God is personal to all. And did you notice that when we were reading? Kind of a little chuckle, because I'm going to share a little bit on the inside of our life with this process. David and I never fight over this. Do we?
No, I'm just
okay.
what would we fight about it?
Well, because we're going to maybe share a little bit different opinions.
Okay, yeah.
Because we're all in a different place on our path, and we've kind of debated whether this was a good idea to present our own thoughts about Ernest Holmes' words or not. And we decided, well, you know what? We have nothing to lose. We're going to go for it, because this is what we really do. What we really do is have those deeper conversations and question each other and prod each other and share what I think, and grow ourselves in that way. And that for me is exactly what discovery is. Well, not completely. Some of it we do within ourselves. So let's move to that idea of choice that you mentioned briefly. So my perspective on this is that we have choice, and we make specific choices. And God does not make choices in the same way we do. Now I know, and David's going to tell you, that Ernest Holmes says that God is self-contemplation, which means God makes choice. For me, within me, everything has to make sense to me. And if God can make choice and say, I am going to now create the heaven and the earth, then God can also say, you are naughty, you are going to suffer the consequence of that. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that God is a judging God, and I know Science of Mind doesn't either, and maybe I will continue looking at this idea, but for me, the idea of God as consciousness is much different than our individualized consciousness. In the last page of oh no, it isn't the last page, that's a different one. In the glossary, Ernest Holmes describes self-choice, and he says this term implies that we have the ability to make selection of one or more things. That is what individuality is. Self-choice with the ability to choose, backed by the power to externalize that choice. To be an individual, a man had to be created with self-choice. So would I say that God has self-choice? I would, in that God experiences it through us. But I wouldn't in that God is already all choice. So how can God select when God already is all that? So that's where I am in our present discussion. And you, sir?
Okay. Ernest Holmes says that God is intelligence. God is divine intelligence. And God is also the law. And so therefore, God holding intelligence must therefore, because intelligence is an active thing, must think. Ernest Holmes says God is self-contemplating. And so it says because God is intelligence, God must think, or, well, not necessarily make choices, but to think. And because God is also law, God is constantly creating, because we know a thought going through the law must produce after its kindness. So therefore, God is constantly creating. Man works exactly the same way in terms of we hold a consciousness, we think about that consciousness, we infuse it with feeling, and create a manifestation as a result of that. To say that God and man create in exactly the same way, it's not exactly the same thing. They may go through the same principle, the same process, but to say that God thinks, that's where we have a challenge. And I kind of have a challenge with that too. In terms of God making judgments, I definitely know that's not the case. If God is all that is, and God were to make choices between one thing or another thing, would be God would say one thing is of more of God essence than the other thing, and that would collapse the entire principle. Everything has to be equal presence of God in all that is. So we create the same way God does because we are of the same essence. We are God, actually, just showing every form. And we use the same principle. However, it can be said that we choose from among the infinite realm of possibilities. And God creates, doesn't necessarily choose, but creates out of its simple creative nature, its divine self-expression. Therefore, it can be said that we actually create the same way, for the same reason, for the same creative nature of longing to express our true nature of who we are. But it feels like, in form, like we're choosing from one possibility to the other. So what if we were to give up the idea of choice? What if we were giving up the idea that we're choosing one possibility over another? And what if we were to assume then they were simply finding or realizing an avenue for self-expression in divinity? Maybe we're like water, simply finding an avenue of least resistance. Or maybe we're just relating to some possibilities, finding a particular relationship or feeling of familiarity with them, relating to them. And so we have the idea of relativity, being a relative or a family, connecting what is ours to do, connecting with what is ours to do. So we can give up the idea of choice. We're not choosing one possibility over all the others. We're looking into the realm of all that is and saying, I believe my expression is in that direction, and that's where I'm going to go. Can you understand that in terms of giving up choices? Wow.
Yep.
We had a class this week about choices and how valuable they are. But what if we didn't look at them as choices, but ideas of personal avenues for self-expression? And through God's self-contemplation, God expresses into the universe exactly the same way.
So what I'm hearing you say is that if I am selecting between chocolate cake or apple pie, I'm not actually choosing the one that I desire. Rather, I am resonating toward an avenue, a frequency that aligns with me in that time.
And if you have more than one piece, you may be expressing yourself a little more.
True.
Not that I'm making any judgments. Ernest Holmes says that man never creates. And now here we come with the whole idea that we're talking about how we create exactly the same way that God creates. And Ernest Holmes throws a wrench in the works saying, man never creates. He discovers and uses. Basically, all creation lies in the realm of possibility. And man discovers pre-established creative possibilities and brings them into manifestation through the use of the law. God actually created, and we're just bringing those creations into manifestation.
And some of us do like to use the word co-create.
Yes.
Because we do have to do it, work it through that process, which all is God. So it has to go through that. And I also think again, the word discovers comes up, and discovers and uses. So we explore within our own mind. We explore all these ideas, and it's been said we use a lot of different words for what God is. And Ernest Holmes in this chapter talks about how philosophy uses one word and science uses another word. And he also talks about the idea that there is only one principle. Now we talk about multiple laws, meaning the law of gravity and the law of cause and effect, and the multiple laws because we think in duality. But there's really only one principle, and that's God. That is God as law and God as spirit. And so we break it down to better understand in certain circumstances so that we can discover a greater understanding. And science, science was the word principle. And in that idea of thinking, everything must make sense. Whatever it is that we choose to believe, we must be able to have it make sense within our own thoughts so that we can then use it to create in our life.
Ernest Holmes talks about the longingness. God longs to express the divine urge for expression. God has the divine urge for expression, and we as humans have that divine urge of expression in us too, because it's God acting through us into the universe. And so therefore the idea of choosing maybe is not so valid as the idea of I choose, or I am wishing, I have this divine urge to express myself with chocolate cake.
There you go. Amen. And you would have picked the chocolate. Well, you would have taken both, I think.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Because I'm like God, I can't choose.
There you go. So let us end today with a quote from Brian Akers, who wrote, "To touch the deepest point within ourselves is to simultaneously brush our fingers along the edges of all existence." And you can count on more about this topic because we intend to explore and put it to practice and use and see what we come up with. Two heads are better than one, right?
Right.
Especially on two different bodies.